When Charles Martinet wasn't cast in the Mario movie, and was then abruptly removed from the games without announcement, there was a lot of baffled and offended backlash from fans. But a lot of this backlash was fueled by unwarranted entitlement that falls apart quickly under scrutiny, as you're going to see right now. So in the 3 parts of this video, part 1 will outline a justification for Mario's movie casting of Chris Pratt, but the important point is it's a justification and rationale why it was more than okay to not cast Charles for the movie. In part 2 of this video, we will explore the justification for Mario's unannounced game recasting, the way that they replaced him in the game with Mr. Afghani and did not even tell gamers that at the time that they dropped the first reveal trailer for Mario Wonder, which featured the new voice of Kevin. And finally, in part 3 of this video, I will be delivering Charles his sentencing, which will specify what Charles needs to do to atone for the way he navigated through his career like a game of checkers instead of chess. Which he made his bed, and once that backfired on him, his public conduct was unprofessional and counterproductive, setting a dishonorable precedent for gamers, aspiring actors, and Tara Strong. So the good news is, for many of you watching this video, this discussion will provide you some peace of mind. By the end of this video, you will realize that this was not an injustice, and Charles wasn't screwed over. There is simultaneously a number of people watching this video that are not going to like it at all. And for those people, it will take at least 3 years until this video's message can even start to sink in. But ultimately, the information on offer here, whether you're ready to hear it or not, will ultimately provide peace of mind, so that you can let go of those clenched fists that you've been clenching for the past year or 2. What this video now aspires to do is illustrate why this situation was not some indecent, shameful incident that we should all automatically condemn. So let's jump into it, guys, the movie casting. Charles, as we all know, was not cast in the Mario movie. That instead went to Chris Pratt, the announcement of which was rolled out when they announced a great deal of the main cast of that movie. Now, I've talked with plenty of people at live streams. We're looking at Tara Strong's public sentiments, with the view that it can only be Charles as Mario in the movie, and anything other than that is completely unacceptable. Well, time out. Anyone with significant familiarity of Nintendo's creative philosophy for video games in particular knows that Mario the character and his voice and what he contributes to the experience is meant to be vague. It's meant to provide quick flavor. It's not supposed to be the center of attention the way Sonic's coolness and attitude clearly is. It's more vague, it's less polarizing, so that the player doesn't overthink the component of the character in the game when really the purpose of the experience is for the gameplay, not to learn about Mario the character and all the nuances of his identity. He's just a vague mustachioed dude. And so that has been the MO of Mario's personality in the games since the beginning. So as much as people really love Charles Martinet's Mario voice and can only envision that as the voice of Mario in the movie, well, you don't take those quick, vague yelps and then expand them into an entire movie of that over-the-top accent. It wouldn't have worked even a little, and the people who are urgently demanding that that's what should have happened, I hate to play this card, but how many movies have you bankrolled? Do you know what you're talking about? Or are you coming at this from the perspective of a hardcore gamer who is losing sight of the fact that the purpose of the movie is not to be a direct feature film translation of the exact gaming experience of Mario games? And anyone who's watched the Sonic movies knows that full well. Looking at you, protracted movie romance scene in the second Sonic movie, right? Hardcore Sonic fans look at that wedding scene and check their watches. Well, who is that wedding scene for? It's not for the hardcore gamers, and I think that hardcore Mario fans lose perspective of that. So to stretch out that very exaggerated accent that only quickly does quick yelps and noises, to stretch that out would be to break Miyamoto's entire philosophy. Okay, now some people would say, oh, alright, if we're not going to have that over-the-top accent for an entire feature film, at least you could bring Charles in to do a new version of the voice, adapted for a major motion picture. But A, doing that different voice would be uncanny, because longtime fans would be constantly constantly conscious of what Mario typically sounds like, gauging that against this new movie-fied version. But it's also that Charles is getting up there in age, and I think there's nothing wrong with wanting to go with a comparatively more youthful-sounding voice. It's not like Chris Pratt is 19 years old, but he's also not a senior citizen. And so the comparative age of Chris Pratt and Charles Martinet was also a major component in the casting, because people forget, when you make a motion picture film as a commodity to be sold on the free marketplace, part of those mechanics involves the promotional cycle. And you can even take Miyamoto and Nintendo out of the equation. If you're the Illumination animation studio, you're thinking about which actors are you going to send as representatives of the movie to go promote it on Oprah or Gayle King or ABC Today. Maybe Charles really wanted to be able to do that press junket circuit, but the movie studio was well within their rights to instead cast an established Hollywood actor that can generate some buzz on the marquee and absolutely charm the pants off of the ladies over at The View. If we're talking about how Charles would have contributed differently to that situation on the morning talk shows, well, that's enough for investors to potentially object. Defaulting to a boring but safe star like Chris Pratt honestly seems super straightforward and non-controversial to me. So if I'm to stop and wonder what was the headspace of Charles Martinet throughout the years and when the talk of a potential movie entered the equation, it could just be as simple as Charles Martinet just thinking, yeah, I'm Mario, it can only be me, and hiring anyone else to do the Mario voice in a movie would be a crying shame. It's unthinkable. If that was Charles Martinet's outlook on all this, that was a misplaced expectation. However Charles or Tara Strong defined should or would is irrelevant. If Charles wasn't able to connect the dots that I did about stretching the vague quick voice too long throughout a feature film or using established star power on the talk show junket circuit, well then Charles just needs to get more people in his life that can help him to think through these situations more critically. Now, some people that I've talked to about this are very quick to look at the entire situation and say, no, Charles is totally fine with the movie situation. After all, his voice is in the movie on two different characters, in a way that treasured and honored his legacy. Well, I gotta say, if any of you out there think that the voices that Charles did for the movie is a clean bill of health that means everything's thumbs up, hunky-dory, everyone's happy on both ends, well, you're giving folks way too much benefit of the doubt, especially due to the overwhelming wealth of evidence indicating that Charles Martinet the person is severely displeased and holding a grudge about the way the movie casting was handled. So what does it say, as previously reported by the Netlore podcast starring Cybershell and Bedhead Bernie, what does it say that Charles Martinet the person, who has always been plenty active on Twitter and social media, regularly tweeting and liking things and replying, what does it say as a starting point that Charles never liked or engaged with or acknowledged literally any single tweet or post about the movie itself? Furthermore, once the movie was building up in full swing, Charles started issuing a directive at his Q&A sessions that basically cautioned the crowd, do not ask anything about the Mario movie. Right? And this is a movie that he was known already that he was going to do a couple of voices in, and yet despite his participation, he requested up front, that topic is off limits. So if Charles Martinet was completely thumbs up okay with the whole situation, then there should be no problem with him taking questions about the film. Think about it. Furthermore, Charles himself did not even attend the premiere. And if you want to say that, oh, he had a convention scheduled for that week, if you choose to believe that, as simple as that, do your thing, but none of the rest of us are obliged to play along, right? This is one of the biggest events in the history of the Mario series and brand, and despite voicing two different characters in the movie, he just didn't show up, or even send a gift basket of premium fruits. And then after the movie came out, people were talking to him at interviews here and there, and he made it clear that he had not yet seen the movie. So not only did he skip the premiere, but he was in no rush to watch it in the months after that. And he's in the movie. Wouldn't watch it. Which of course brings us to the last major point to touch upon for the movie situation, which is Tara Strong's tweets. She took to her soapbox to lament what a crying shame and injustice this was. It was basically hashtag should have been Charles, and she was rallying the troops to surround Charles and console him in his time of sorrow and need. And the thing is, Charles was all about this because he replied to it with a gushing emotional message explaining that Tara's commentary meant so much to him and he was tearing up. And so look, everything that's been outlined in this video so far is more than enough to demonstrate how Tara Strong's grandstanding was really misplaced and out of place. It's fine if her opinion is that it should have been Charles, but to rant about it and make a big scene as if it was some indecent crime against art, when you do this, Tara Strong, you make it so that it's even harder to take voice actors and actresses seriously in the future if these situations continue to occur. Do you think anyone rioted when they announced that the Sonic movies would not be voiced by Sonic voice actor Roger Craig Smith, but instead Hollywood starlet Ben Schwartz? Well, part of the reason for us being amenable to that as Sonic fans is partly because the Sonic English voice actor has changed more than once over the past couple of decades, and that very valuable flexibility that is available to Sega based on the way they've handled it is something that you get the sense that Nintendo is a little bit jealous of that, wants to have that flexibility where they are not relying dependent on a single must-have star that's setting all the terms and conditions. You can think of it almost that Charles got too valuable, too specific. And that was never supposed to be the part of what Mario's identity is. Miyamoto wants you to play a Mario game and just be immersed in the fun and magic of the moment of the discovery of each level, not looking at Mario and experiencing his whole deal through the prism of, oh, I know it's Charles behind the scenes. You're supposed to be thinking about a plumber, not a voice actor. So, of course, Tara Strong is going to have her totally pro-voice actor lobby take on the matter, maximizing the numbers of gigs for the voice actors themselves. But the fact is, Charles was hired by Nintendo to do a job. And then after that, he was hired to do another job. But at no point did those contracts extend to the movie, and so Charles unwarrantedly assumed that he was an indispensable aspect of the Mario experience. But the fact is, and people need to not forget this, Nintendo made Charles Martinet. If not for the Mario role, who knows if we would have even ever heard of him. And while it is true that Charles's take on the voice was his own contribution in contrast to the more gruff, rough take on deep-voiced Mario in the live-action movie, but it is still nonetheless true to say that it was Nintendo that recognized that that would work and then put it in all the different games throughout the years. That was Nintendo's choice to freely elect to do that. Okay, so now we're arriving at part 2 of this video, which is going to build upon a lot of the things that we just discussed surrounding the movie situation. This will shed some more illuminating light on the video game situation. Okay, and as I sat here and thought about this, one possibility that occurred to me as far as why Charles was let go from his voice acting responsibilities for the video games, starting with Mario Wonder, one plausible possibility is that there was a fallout between Nintendo and Charles because of the movie, and so Nintendo had just had enough, and they were like, all right, we've been maybe looking to get a new voice actor for a bit, maybe with the fallout from the movie, it might as well be time to plow ahead with this because the bridge is somewhat burned as it is. Okay, but that's just a possibility. Whether or not it was a direct consequence of the movie fallout, one thing we know for sure, and I'm going to hold everyone in the audience to this very basic critical thinking tenet, Charles Martinet did not retire. He did not choose to step down. And a lot of people are looking at that Charles and Miyamoto video as evidence of, see, look, everything's fine. He wanted to step back and become the ambassador. That's ridiculous for a great many reasons, including the fact that after the announcement of the new Kevin Afghani era, Charles made it crystal clear in interviews that he's not retired. There is nothing about Charles Martinet's arc as a voice actor that resulted in him choosing to retire or step back. because he's still doing voice acting gigs for plenty of other prominent projects outside of Nintendo. And furthermore, after the Mario Ambassador title change was revealed, Charles Martinet overtly said in interviews that he didn't yet know what that new ambassador position was gonna even be. So listen, I can definitely extend some sympathy to Charles. Perhaps he did have misplaced expectations about the work he was entitled to in the movie or games, but I can still empathize with the potentially very lonely, frustrating experience of being left out to dry by Nintendo, not knowing what the next steps were going to look like, and then having to put a happy face on it to the best of his ability in interviews and conventions. Okay, but the other plausible possibility as to why Nintendo would relieve Charles of his voice acting duties in the series of video games is because he was aging and perhaps his vocal cord abilities weren't what they had been in years past. Now, some people have looked at a couple recent examples of voice performances Charles has done in the games and said, look, he's perfectly fine in these games, what's the big deal? But you need to do a bit more reconnaissance with that, because if anyone is going to have a firm opinion about this Charles Martinet situation one way or the other, at the very least, you need to take a look and listen at all the prominent YouTube videos on the topic, because you will find evidence that contradicts what you are trying to insist, that Charles' voice is perfectly fine. All you need to do is listen to that Netlore podcast episode where they provide a very clear-cut example from the fairly recent Luigi's Mansion 3, where it's a scene where there's supposed to be a big dramatic yell from Luigi, but you can clearly tell that he's just kind of taking it easy and doing a very constrained, underwhelming wah, like he's not able to do what he used to. And so you can look at that and immediately declare that Nintendo had just cause to move in a different direction with Kevin Afghani. And so what that would mean is that different parties involved with this definitely have a different opinion, a different take about whether Charles was too old and if his skills as a voice actor had significantly deteriorated. Charles himself seems to be of the view that he's still running on all cylinders, that he still has the voice acting prowess and physicality that he always did. And part of the reason you can conclude this is because he's made it very clear in interviews is that when people ask him, how long does he see himself doing the Mario voice, he's basically said that I'll do it until I drop dead. I'm in it for the long haul, but he did specify that if a day comes where he feels that he is no longer able to do the voice, that he will tell Nintendo that, yep, I have to step back from this, you should find a new person to do the voice. Now, that's super interesting because the only way that Charles ever worded that was to say, it's my call. I, Charles, will be the person who decides that I'm no longer able to do the voice sufficiently anymore. But Charles seemed to not even think or consider the possibility that Nintendo might arrive at a time where they determine that Charles is no longer sufficient for the role. So that's a bit of unfortunate arrogance on Charles's part to think that only he would be able to render a verdict that he's now too old to fulfill the duties of voice acting Mario. So since Charles had no contingency plan for Nintendo determining it was no longer a good fit, it's really kind of baffling. These are unforced errors, contingencies that any professional participant should be cognizant of. So really that only stems specifically from Charles's under-preparation, right? If I'm Charles Martinet, I'm going to talk to Nintendo and ask the question of what are my long-term prospects? Can I rely on these voice gigs? Should I expect them to keep coming? Or might there come a day where you're going to hire somewhere else? Charles just seemed to default to the expectation that he would keep getting hired forever, to be interrupted only by Charles declaring that he was no longer fit. And so the heartbreak and confusion that he got was in part a disaster of his own making. If Nintendo is said to have thousands and thousands of millions of voice clips of Charles doing any number of yelps and expressions, that's really bizarre to me because that would almost imply, you would infer, that since they have a massive database of all those dynamic voice clips, that there would be a mutually understood understood plan in place for how those clips would be used in perpetuity. Would Charles need to get paid every time that they drew from that bank of sound clips? Having that massive of a database would almost give the impression that they planned to use Charles's voice clips even long after he was no longer in the game or no longer a sufficient voice actor. So does the casting of Kevin Afghani possibly indicate a change of plans that would otherwise have been Charles permanently using that infinite bank of sound clips? Now, I've not seen any documentation that Charles asked for a bigger pay raise, but at the same time, it's plausible to consider that after doing the voice for years and years, that it absolutely would have been cheaper to hire Kevin Afghani. For example, Kevin Afghani became available to Nintendo, and I hate to share this heartbreaking detail, through a voiceover agency, through a middleman, right? You think about the poor contractors at Nintendo of America who have it rough. Well, now we are even outsourcing to contractors the voice of Mario. Kevin Afghani is just another client in that network of contracted agency-bound voice actors. And so who knows how long, if at all, Nintendo was looking to sunset Charles and bring in a more affordable, low-key voice actor, but the movie fallout certainly couldn't have helped. I'm just saying. Now, although I do maintain the stance that Nintendo is well within their rights of decency and precedent to fire an employee at any time for any reason, especially if said things are spelled out in the contract. There was no contract clause that guaranteed Charles work for like decades indefinitely. That being said, I can absolutely empathize with the idea that to get suddenly fired, that's very uneasy, very unpleasant. I don't wish that on anyone, although I do advocate that any employee in any workspace be prepared for that contingency and not leave themselves vulnerable to a sudden heartbreak. But I've worked at jobs where I got this uneasy feeling because after a while I noticed that sometimes my colleagues who I would say hello to every day, pass their desk, check in with them, say hello, and then suddenly one day I come in and they're just gone. They didn't say that they were leaving, and maybe they didn't know that they were leaving until the day it happened, and management did not announce or disclose squat. So I can definitely tell you that that kind of work environment is not anything that I personally would ever sign up for or participate in and contribute to directly. I don't want, for example, the employees at my business to feel like anyone could just be abruptly thrust onto the chopping block at any time. It kind of takes away the humanity, the genuine interpersonal connections you have with people on a team. How can I get invested in the synergy of my workplace and developing meaningful colleague relationships if anyone could up and disappear with a blink of an eye? And so I say this, these sudden firings aren't everybody join hands together and feel good, but Nintendo is within their rights to conduct business that way. And so all you can do is vote with your wallet and vote with your voice. And so I'll be the first to say that when I first discovered that the Mario Wonder trailer had been dropped without disclosing the recasting of Kevin Afghani as Mario, I was very off-put. That felt like that was very impersonal, way too cutthroat. It's like, wow, it's totally understandable for a gamer to feel unease with this, having played all the games throughout the years and getting so understandably emotionally attached to the nostalgia of Charles' voice, and to see it up and blink and disappear like that, it's almost like you have an existential crisis. It's like, it meant so much to me, did it not mean anything to Nintendo or other gamers? Well, right, I totally get where you're coming from as a starting point. So to perhaps alleviate some of your unease about the shadowy, non-transparent recasting of Mario's voice, I would like you to consider the following justification, which supports with valid reasons why Nintendo would make that at the time controversial decision to drop the trailer without telling everybody it was Afghani. Okay, so first of all, Nintendo is very understandably expected to want to avoid a round 2 of the backlash that they got with the Mario movie recasting. It's almost like the movie casting of Chris Pratt became a soft warm-up for what might be down the line in the event Nintendo decided to recast Charles. And so Nintendo saw all the aggressive backlash that Chris Pratt's casting got, and so it's reasonable to expect them to have a thought process where, like, well, we know people are going to be super opposed to recasting him in Mario Wonder, so if we are honest about that and disclose it up front, people are going to make up their minds beforehand. They're going to listen to the new voice clips with a jaded critical ear, and they're not going to like it automatically because on principle, because it should still be Charles, say they. Okay, and so where Nintendo's choice to drop the new trailer without disclosing the staffing change makes sense is because the fact that they didn't tell us meant that us listening to that Mario Wonder trailer was essentially a genuine single blind test to determine, can we recast Mario and present it just as Mario, and will people buy that and accept it? And the answer is very unfortunately yes. Now, don't get me wrong, there are absolutely multiple people out there who, the day that Mario Wonder trailer dropped, they knew for a fact it was not Charles. But for every Charles denier, there were 5 other people who were very vocally saying, no, this is Charles. You can listen to the Netlore podcast outlining the reasons cited by these people who were pushing back at the Charles doubters saying, dude, Nintendo would never recast Mario without telling us. That's unthinkable. Right? So those people who said that are sentenced to 5 years of irrelevance because you're giving Nintendo way too much benefit of the doubt. You clearly do not know the first thing about Nintendo's cutthroat business operating procedures and practices, and your cognitive dissonance about that was so thick that you attempted to chase people away from valid concern and criticisms. So the fact is, Nintendo took that risk to see if people would accept that as a genuine Mario voice, and so they just took a play from the Reggie Fils-Aimé playbook. Don't ask for permission, ask for forgiveness after the fact. If anything, just go ahead and do it and deal with the fallout later. And so if we knew that it was going to be a different voice actor, you can only imagine what the crowd response would have been, because everyone would have been critiquing it with that foreknowledge that it wasn't Charles, and be a lot more critical of it. So that placebo factor to this is very real, and the only way Nintendo could have found out that Kevin Afghani's performance was passable was to present it without disclosing the behind-the-scenes situation and see how it played out. And so what Nintendo, tragically or otherwise, proved with that Mario Wonder reveal is that Charles Martinet is replaceable, that Charles Martinet is not irreplaceable, and it brings me no joy to say that. But the fact that Nintendo proved that, put all their chips on the table and went for it, is Nintendo's rather based W. It brings me no joy to say that, but I would be disingenuous not to acknowledge it. So look, if Kevin Afghani is more affordable because he's contracted through an agency, we know Nintendo has a big emphasis on their bottom line. Just look at the recent controversies with Switch-gen Pokemon games. And even in addition to the fact of Kevin Afghani being more affordable as a newcomer, well, there's also the aspect that Nintendo doesn't want the actor behind the character to become too big and iconic and super valued and be seen as irreplaceable. Kevin Afghani seems to just be operating in the background, which is totally his prerogative to do so, and in fact, that may have well been a condition of him getting hired. Nintendo could have said, we're not looking for you to be, a big social media personality. It's great if you can just do your work and then just be a private citizen. That way there's no baggage. You're not going to get in trouble and complicate the Mario series by putting your foot in your mouth on Twitter. And so, look, I would have preferred, perhaps, that there was a bit more transparency and mutual understanding on both sides. But if Charles's expectations were so misplaced with the movie situation, well, then all bets are off. It's very plausible for me to imagine that Nintendo was very rightly justified with Charles's pouty behavior surrounding the movie, that all of the goodwill that they had had with him was now drained out, and that led to a less dignified, sudden abrupt exit from the games. So I think many, many Mario fans and Nintendo gamers, as well as Charles himself, Tara Strong, and other folks that participate in the voice acting lobby, your massive reality check from all of this is that you have an inflated perception of how businesses operate in the real world. For all the team building exercises that they put together, and they have posters on the walls celebrating company values of integrity and teamwork and everything is valued, if you expect every business that participates in the economy to actually follow through on those principles that they tout, that's misguided. Look, they should be standing true to what they claim, but businesses are businesses, and I'm not defending them on the basis of some of these choices, but it's the kind of thing where you shouldn't be surprised and outraged about it in a way that now your ego and your entire worth as a performer now feels undervalued and disrespected. Now, before we get to Charles's sentencing, I'm going to cite a very relevant citation from a most excellent television program on HBO, which is called Industry. And this is one of the best programs I have ever encountered in the post-Sopranos world. It's not perfect. It does have an excess amount of unnecessary gratuitous sex scenes. But aside from that, this program, Industry, is the real deal, people. But there's a character that gets fired with a speech that is absurdly similarly overlapping to this Charles Martinet situation. So get a load of this. This guy, he's a career man. He's been a company man supporting the whole enterprise for much of his life, and he abruptly gets fired. And why is that? Well, it's because his sales numbers in the last 4 quarters has been abysmal. And what he tries to say in pleading the case for his continued employment is that he says, so what, I had 4 bad quarters. What about the 100 quarters before that? And the dude looks at him and says, you know full well that the last 4 quarters are the only quarters that ever matter. And for all the exceptional performances that you put on throughout your career, that does not entitle you to continued valued employment in perpetuity. You will only continue to be compensated for the work that you do that year, that quarter. And so he gives it to him straight. He says, you know full well that here at this business, nobody owes anybody a tomorrow. And so the thing is, this guy isn't technically fired on the show. He's still an employee of the company, but they move him to a different role. They say, we want you to now run the client relationship effort across Europe. Does this sound familiar, people? The Mario ambassador role? He says, as the client relationship manager, you're going to have shorter hours, less stress, increased interactions. You're going to socialize with clients. Away from the melee on the floor. It's a retirement home. And I kid you not, that word melee is in the script, in that scene. That's not a Smash Brothers pun. So the idea that this longtime career man would be sunset, but not totally fired, but removed from the real job that he had to instead be a figurehead, doing low-stakes, breezy conversational work, maintaining client relations, in the same way that Charles Martinet, who presumably signed an NDA and worked out an agreement with Nintendo to be able to continue using the Mario branding in all of his convention appearances. You guys seeing the similarities here? So all that is to say that there's ample precedent for the way that Charles's career was sunset at Nintendo, and I am not saying that anyone needs to feel good or supportive of this approach, but it shouldn't be baffling. It shouldn't be outrageous. It should not make you clench your fists. If anything, it should make you stop and pause and decide how you truly feel about the Nintendo company. And we're going to get to that ultimate equation that you will be forced to reckon with soon, after Charles's sentencing, which we have arrived at now. I will now be issuing Charles his sentence, which will specify what he needs to do in order to atone for this situation. And I know for a lot of you, it's mind-boggling to hear me say that, because you regard Charles as this martyr who they did him dirty. He's a victim. He was dishonored. But by this point in the video, we have discussed numerous business realities in Hollywood, in the voice acting rat race, none of which gives me particular pleasure, but I will not cheer on the sob stories of martyrs who find themselves blindsided because they have an inflated storybook perception of how the economy works. So Charles Martinet, former voice of Mario, I sentence you to owning your errors of unwarranted assumptions about the gigs that you are entitled to. If I'm playing your games at home and I see you as a longtime voice actor for Mario, well, I am assuming that you've touched base with Nintendo and ironed out a long-term game plan of how much employment you can continue to expect throughout the years and be prepared for any contingencies in which not just you choose to retire, but also Nintendo deciding that it's time to go in a new direction. You clearly had no plan for that, and you operated on the assumption that you were the irreplaceable, indispensable contributor to whom the Mario series owes a great deal of its success. And of course, look, it helped, but you lost sight of the fact that you were hired to do a job. And since you wanted to believe in a rosy storybook conclusion for your career, it led you straight into a brick wall of a rude awakening in a manner that you could have shown more class. To essentially boycott the movie by not attending the premiere and not so much as acknowledging a word of anything about the movie on social media, where you were regularly active, engaging with any number of other topics. You took to your soapbox to bawl when Tara Strong took her misguided voice actress-centric stance. And so one of the consequences of that is that you're leading by example, and you are now setting a precedent to upcoming generations of voice actors or game designers that they should feel that same expectation of entitlement to continued employment in perpetuity when only you can say when it should stop. So since Charles is not preparing his generation of audience members for those business realities, what I can say to folks, Nintendo fans or otherwise, is that if you are at all interested in these fields, you should figure out all this stuff up front. There is no reason why you should ever be blindsided or heartbroken by any of these developments down the road. And if you think that your performing talent is uniquely magical and no one could ever question or replace it, the only person who will suffer as a result of that choice is you and your fans who have bought into it full bore. And so now that I've sentenced Charles, I'm just going to kind of float a thing or two to Nintendo fans who are watching this from a distance. Everything that I've said about Nintendo, about weighing the justifications for their choices versus the drawbacks, there are certain things Nintendo did that were disappointing to me on a personal level, but it's not the kind of thing that I would write a bunch of outraged tweets or like shame Nintendo publicly and try to pressure them with a peer pressure campaign to get them to change their ways. My only recourse is to vote with my wallet, and with my voice too, but not in a way that I'm now starting a campaign of shame. So Nintendo fans have to decide whether they want to still patronize Nintendo by being a customer that buys their consoles and games, toys, feature films, everything. If Nintendo's corporate decisions are so upsetting to you, well, by continuing to buy their products, like it or not, you are giving them a continual thumbs up of approval. And we talked about this recently with the Pokemon Sword and Shield situation. Because if Pokemon fans feel like they're getting shortchanged with each subsequent generation of Pokemon games, well, the fact is, if you're voting with your wallet and continuing to buy both versions of the new Pokemon game that comes out on the day of release, you're sending a clear signal to Nintendo that everything's okay. Because Nintendo will continue to do exactly as much as they can get away with. They will expedite the sunset of the Wii U to get going with the next console, to leave the loyal supporters and money spenders of the Wii U are left out to dry. They will similarly delay the launch of the Switch 2 for as long as possible as a de facto punishment for continued purchases by the masses of the Switch 1. So they're a business that's going to get away with what they can, and if you're going to continue buying their products, no problem. There's nothing wrong with voicing your disagreement, but to make it this big dramatic stand and an injustice, you're just giving Nintendo a brief opportunity for a mild chuckle before moving on to their next business agenda item. So, is this Charles Martinet situation enough for any of you to swear off of Nintendo as a boycott in solidarity? Well, of course course not. I've never heard anyone who's jumping ship on Nintendo because of this, just like they're still going to buy Nintendo games despite the fact that some of the music composers weren't credited in the Mario movie, or the original developers of Metroid Prime were not credited in some cases for the Metroid Prime remastered credits, right? This is a company that has all but taken your continued purchases for granted, and you should look no further than the advertising campaign for Tears of the Kingdom. When it came to Tears of the Kingdom, Nintendo seemed to take the core Zelda fan base's purchase for granted, because the deluxe advertisement campaign that came out was that rich, depressed man who was sneaking in little gameplay sessions on the brief opportunities he had during his 85-hour work week. And so it's like, well, we know we have the Zelda lobby as a guaranteed day one $70 purchase, so let's try to instead focus our efforts and courtship of the new market, the market that was opened up with the Wii 1. Casuals, people just dipping into gaming here and there to have a brief moment of childlike innocence before going back to their droning job 85 hours a week. So if any fans are going to continue having this angsty backlash, well, just admit that if you're going to continue supporting Nintendo, then it's all a moot point. You might as well just acknowledge that Nintendo is too big to fail at this point, because they would have to do so much worse things for you to ever vote with your wallet. But when Metroid 6 comes out, admit it, you're going to buy a Switch 2 as soon as Metroid 6 becomes available. So until you acknowledge that Nintendo fans' integrity is compromisable for a price, then any soapboxing you do will ring totally hollow and futile. And so I know as we wind down this video, many of you are angry about what you've heard, and that's to be expected. It's going to take 3 years until you can even start to process and acknowledge the practical realities of how everything got to this situation. But for the rest of you, if this video shed a little bit of light and made the situation a little less mysterious, well then that was a successful intended outcome. And as one final parting word, you can give all the benefit of the doubt to Charles himself and make Nintendo to be this evil, soulless company, but you also have to extend some benefit of the doubt the other way, because we know so little about what happened behind the scenes. And if Charles Martinet made a big stink about the movie casting, and suddenly Nintendo put him in the doghouse in regard to the games, well then it could have been that Charles said something misguided behind the scenes that led Nintendo to sunset him in the impersonal, seemingly heartless business manner that they were nonetheless within their rights to follow through on. So, otherwise, get hyped for the next Mario game, guys. I don't think there were that many people rushing to the defense of the fired Bayonetta voice actress. Do you see the Mario situation as any different than the Bayonetta situation? Are they both equally understandable, or are they equally an injustice to the voice actress because the way that they were with Charles? So that introduces the aspect of like, do you think that a voice actor suddenly is entitled to permanent job security after they do a certain amount of roles? I would ask you to think about that in a way that may expose how arbitrary and vague that expectation is. There's ample precedent for this. The voice of Solid Snake by David Hayter is even more integral to the Metal Gear experience throughout the years, because it's not just quick yelps and noises, it's entire soliloquies, novels worth of spoken dialogue. So for Kojima to drop voice actor David Hayter as the voice of Snake for Metal Gear Solid 5, something that he had apparently been striving to do for a good while and finally made it happen, Kojima was well within his rights and even decency to do that, and I have to wonder why David Hayter could have been so blindsided by that. Maybe he had a similar storybook trust in the fate of the universe that would continue valuing his irreplaceable continued voice work. And look, I could maybe make the case against recasting someone else as Solid Snake, but it was Venom Snake, who was technically a different human and much older. If the Switch 2 launches with a new 3D Mario, you are required to acknowledge, like it or not, that Kevin Afghani is good enough because his voice passed for Charles Martinet's in a blind study when that trailer was revealed. If anything, that's one final wake-up call to fans, that the idea that Charles's contributions were uniquely irreplaceable and integral to the entire experience, well, that that facade was torn down through a brisk set of straightforward, quasi-based business decisions. So I'll see you guys for the Switch 2 reveal. Try to keep your head up. It has been my honor to deliver you these harsh reality checks with nonetheless integrity and compassion, if not tough love. This has been Alex Yard here at 91.6 WAYZ, the Alex Yard Zone. Take care. And if you still find yourself tussled up about all this, become a Sonic fan, because we seem to have no misconceptions or heartbreaks about how the video game industry operates.